going through these core values. And before we get into that this morning, I want to ask you, I have this philosophy on life that if I own something that's amazing, if I've invested some money into getting something that's really good quality, I like to use that item to its fullest potential. That's a little bit of my philosophy. I don't like to buy something that's really good just to have it sit on the shelf and collect dust. I don't know if you can share that philosophy with me. Do you like using things to their fullest potential? I've got a story about that. Years ago, I was the wilderness camping coordinator for an incredible ministry in the north end of Winnipeg. In the north end of Winnipeg, one of the highest crime areas in the nation of Canada. And I was the wilderness camping coordinator. We had this great inner city ministry right in that tough neighborhood. And I would take kids, gang members, all kinds of kids through rough situations. I would take them to this beautiful northern Manitoba camp up in the Canadian Lakes. And that camp was so remote that we had to take a gravel road. We had a big school bus. We would load it up with kids. We would be on a gravel road for the last hour, winding around these lakes. And then we could get within 2 miles of the lake called Gem Lake. And it was a gem. It was amazing. It was a huge lake. And we got within 2 miles, and then all the kids would get out, and we'd have to hike the last 2 miles just to get to the shore. And when we got to the shore, all our boats were lined up along the shore. We had to get in our boats and boat 7 miles across the lake just to get to those cabins. No electricity. Everything was propane and solar. There was only one other cabin on that massive lake, and they flew in to their cabin. So we walked and boated into ours. But we would get to that 2 mile mark where the trail started towards the lake. And we didn't make the kids carry all their gear because there was a lot of gear. So we had this nice ATV with a huge custom-made trailer, and we'd put all the gear in there for a week, all the food, all the gear for the whole week. It was a big trailer, and that trail was rough. I mean, it was up and down cliffs, over logs, through swamps. It was a rough trail. So we bought the biggest Polaris ATV we could find. I mean, that thing had the most horsepower. It was the biggest one they had at the time, and that was a beautiful machine. I mean, that machine was a beast. I mean, it was so powerful, so big, and I would get on that thing with that huge trailer filled with gear, and it was overflowing, and the trailer was already this tall, solid metal trailer, and I would go up cliffs and down cliffs and through swamps and over trees, and I'd have to go about as slow as the kids walked, because that's how slow I had to go just to navigate that crazy trail. And I would have the same thought in my mind. I'm just like, I love this ATV. This thing is so amazing. And the best part was when we got to the shore finally after that long hike and drive, we got to the shore, we unloaded the trailer, we unhitched the trailer, and then I would go take that ATV and I'd go have to hide it in the bushes at a special lock spot so no one would steal it. And when that thing had the trailer off, man, I would fly with that thing. I mean, it was like I was floating off of cliffs. I was floating over boulders and over trees. I had that thing completely submerged underwater, and I would just get right out of there. It was just the most amazing thing. You guys, I had spiritual experiences on that ATV. I mean, I may have gotten a little charismatic on that ATV. I was just like, hallelujah, this is the best thing ever. And for me, the spiritual experience was like, aren't people amazing that they can create this kind of perfect machine? And look what we do. We dig minerals out of the ground and pump oil out of the ground to make this ATV. Isn't God good that He created us to be able to create something like that? And I loved using it to the fullest of its potential. And that was a spiritual experience. I thought some people buy these things and they just putt around on them. You know, and then this thing is meant to go off cliffs. This thing is meant to be underwater and go over trees. So for me, that was incredible. We all probably have things that we have that we've invested in that we want to use to their fullest ability. For guys, it's easy because I know the mind of a guy, right? For me, it's my DeWalt tool. I don't have very many of them because they're so expensive. If you know anything about tools, DeWalt's, those are the good tools, right? They're not the Harbor Freight tools that break after one job. Most of my tools are those. But I got my DeWalt tools. Those things are amazing. For you guys, maybe your trucks, right? If you got a good truck, you want to use that thing to the fullest of its ability. For some of the ladies here, I know we have some quilting ladies. I think they might all be at quilting camp, apparently, this week. I think we got some quilting ladies here. There you go. Your tools that you have, that you invest into these quilting machine things, I've just seen the results of those, and the results are amazing, right? If you invest your money into those things, you want to use them to their fullest ability. There's nothing worse than receiving something or getting something or investing into something just to have it sit on the shelf. All of this leads us somewhere. I believe that the gift of grace is one of the most underutilized gifts that we have, that God has given us. The gift of grace is so powerful. It is at the core of our faith, and it should be at the core of our lives. And if we use the gift of grace, grace has the potential to transform our faith. It has the potential to transform our personal lives. It has the power to transform our relationships. And yet too often, I believe, Christians, we kind of know in our head what grace is, but we don't know how big it is, how extravagant it is. Man, we don't maybe embrace it for ourselves the way we can. And we certainly often don't extend grace to other people the way we should. But if we can just grasp that value of grace a little more today, then that will be a win. We're in this series where we've talked about our mission statement, and our mission statement is to make an impact in our community with the message of Jesus with extraordinary love. And last week we talked about how our core value number one is Jesus. Jesus is the center of everything we do. And today we're talking about grace, and we've got a new banner up on the church. Every time we do a new core value, we're going to put a new banner up in the church. With grace, we receive people with grace and treat them as God's grace, how God has shown us grace as well. And then we say everybody is welcome at Heritage. So that's the theme we've been on, and today we're going to go back into Colossians. Last week we were in Colossians for Jesus. Today we'll be back in Colossians for grace. And we want to understand that God has, number one, God has extravagant grace for us. This gift of grace is so extravagant our minds can barely comprehend it. And Paul is going to explain that to us in Colossians. So Colossians chapter 3, we're going to start at verse 12, and we're going to all the way through 17 eventually, but we're going to take one verse at a time and look at this extravagant grace that God has gifted to us if we'd only grasp it and receive it. It starts like this. Colossians 3, verse 12 to 17. It says, hold on, I'm at the wrong verse here. Colossians 3, I'm used to my teaching TV, but you have to have grace with us today because we have no internet. So we've had little hot spots all over the church trying to get things done, but not the teaching TV. All right, Colossians 3, verse 12 to 13 says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves, and Paul uses this a lot. He says, clothe yourselves with all kinds of different great things, compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. So let's take this a little bit at a time. God says we are His chosen people. That's God extending grace to us. When we choose to follow Him, He calls us His chosen people, which is a little confusing in the Bible because in the first whole big part of the Bible, who are God's chosen people? They're the Israelites. They're the Jews. The Jews are God's chosen people. But now in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, Paul is saying, no, if you make a decision to follow Jesus, you are God's chosen people. And that is an extension of grace. Where before, when the Old Testament we read about the Israelites and they were God's special chosen people, now if we take an opportunity to follow Jesus, we are part of the chosen people. Galatians 3, we'll jump into there for just a second, expands on that chosen people part, because that part, for me, is so powerful. That's such an amazing evidence of God's grace towards us right now. Galatians 3, verse 26 to 29 says, and this is Paul writing to a different church. He was writing to Colossae, but now he's writing to Galatians here. He says, so in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. When you take that step of faith, you are a child of God. For all of you who are baptized into Christ, you have clothed yourselves with Christ. There's Paul again saying you put on Christ when you make that faith decision. He says, then he goes into detail. There's neither Jew or Gentile. There's neither slave nor free. There's neither male or female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. You're heirs of God's kingdom, and because he's extending his grace to you through Jesus. And that's an extravagant grace. Being heirs to God's kingdom, that's extravagant. We can't even wrap our minds around how amazing that is. But we're called God's chosen people. We are holy and dearly loved. I don't know about you guys, but I don't often feel very holy. I don't know if you can relate to me here. Hopefully at Heritage, we're not just sitting around polishing our halos, right? We can be real at Heritage. I don't feel very holy a lot of the times. I don't feel very pure a lot of the times. I struggle with this sinful mindset that I've been born with. I struggle with this selfish mindset that I've been born with. So how is it that Paul says you are God's chosen people and you are holy? How is it that God can look at us as holy when I don't feel very holy, you guys? And the truth is, none of us are holy on our own. We are all fallen people. We all make mistakes. We all slip. We all fall. We're all selfish at the core. We're born into that with that selfish sin nature. And yet Paul says, no, you as God's chosen people, when you take a step of faith, you're holy. And this is by the grace of God. This is only through Jesus that God would consider us holy. It's his gift of grace to us, because without Jesus, we are not holy at all. We are very unholy people, let's admit it. So we got to put this in the right context. By myself, I can do nothing. By myself, I am an unholy, sinful person. And yet, through Jesus alone, God can view me as holy. And I need to embrace that. I need to say, yes, God, through Jesus, I am holy. I am a child of God. I can be pure through the forgiveness, through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that is a gift of grace, that we could be viewed as holy. Because, you guys, I can't earn that on my own, and none of you can either. We can't earn it. We can only receive it as a gift of God through Jesus. We are holy. We are dearly loved. God loved us so much that he sent his only Son, right? God loved us that much. We are dearly loved by him. And we're called to forgive as the Lord forgave us. We're dearly loved. A couple other verses. 1 John 1 verse 9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us. I don't feel pure on my own, but through Jesus I can be made pure. Ephesians 2 verse 8 and 9 it says, it is by grace. It is by grace that you have been saved through faith. This is not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And Paul, when he writes to the Colossians, he's trying to correct their biggest mistake. And if you remember last week, we talked about in Colossians, Paul had never been to Colossae, a Roman city, but there was a buddy of his he was mentoring called Epaphras, and Epaphras was trying to pastor that church, and their one main problem is that they didn't understand grace. That was their biggest problem. They didn't understand what grace meant and how to receive it and how to extend it to others because they believed they had to work for it on their own. They believed they had to earn holiness by the things that they did and by being perfect, by obeying all the laws, they would earn their own holiness. And that was a core value that they were completely off on. So Paul is saying through this passage, through this letter of Colossae, no, grace is a gift, and it's only through Jesus. And when you receive that gift, you use that gift to its fullest amount because it can transform your church and transform your faith and transform your relationships. That was the problem with Colossae. That's what Paul was trying to correct. He was trying to describe the extravagant grace. See, I believe that the church in Colossae, and often our church, and us as Christians in general, we have a grace but theology. A grace but theology. Yeah, we believe in grace, but not for these people, right? We believe in grace, but, it's not, it just doesn't go on forever, right? We believe in grace, but, and you could put in, we all struggle with this, we got to admit it. We all struggle with, yeah, I believe in grace, but what about those people? What about those people over there? Whoever your people are that rub you the wrong way, maybe they're opposed to what you believe in, maybe you're just having a tough time with them. We believe in grace, but not for the politicians of all things, right? Not for them, right? So we have kind of a grace but theology. And that's something that I believe we need to work on. Because if we have grace but, maybe we don't understand how extravagant God's grace is. It gets tricky, right? Because I believe, okay, that person made a decision or they turned their ways around. Okay, they get grace, but what if they're still addicted to something? Or what if they fall? Or what if they still struggle? Or what if they turn their lives around, but they still don't believe all the things that I believe about everything? Grace but. I believe God's grace is bigger than a grace but theology. It's extravagant grace through Jesus. The through Jesus is the key, right? He's still core value number one. It's all through Jesus that grace is extended and received. So, let's try not to have a grace but theology like the church in Colossae did. We'll go on. Verse 14 to 16 in Colossians chapter 3. Over all these things, over all the things he just said, all those fruits of grace, all those compassion, kindness, forgive each other, over all these things, over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell in you richly. This is describing God's extravagant grace, but this also goes a step forward to say you need to embrace that grace. Because it's one thing to understand how big God's grace is. It's another thing to say, I'm going to accept that into my own life. I'm going to embrace that grace. I'm going to let the peace of Christ rule in my heart. And I believe that's what happens, you guys, when we accept and embrace the grace. That peace of Christ can rule in our hearts. And how much does our world long for that? You guys, in a world of anxiety and stress and turmoil and chaos, how much do we want the love of Jesus, the peace of Jesus to rule our hearts? When we embrace grace, the peace of Jesus can rule in our own personal lives. And that's what the whole world is looking for, right? That is the power of grace. Without that grace, what are we stuck with? Guilt. We're stuck with guilt. We're stuck with chains of sin. We're stuck with, we might even have faith, but if we don't embrace God's grace, we might have the head knowledge, but we're not embracing the peace. We're going to have faith without freedom. We're always going to be racked with guilt. We're going to have, I believe, if you don't accept that grace, you're going to have low self-esteem. You're going to think poorly of yourself. I'm always messing up. I'm always falling back into the same old, same old. My life is just a failure, right? And we think sometimes that if everybody knew the real us, no one would like us because we know the real us. And we maybe haven't embraced God's incredible grace of forgiveness and being freed up from the chains of guilt. We need to embrace that grace. And here's the problem also. We think, well, thankfully, no one does know us on the inside. We only know our fallibilities. We only know how bad we are. But God knows how bad we are. We know that God knows the real us. And sometimes we think, and I've been there many times in my life, if God knows the real me, how could God love me? How can God accept me? If God knows the real me, He must be so disappointed in me. And we can get trapped into that guilt. And it's almost like chains that are holding us down. Yet if we accept His grace, we can be freed up. We can be freed up from that guilt. And this is a balancing act. And Paul, thankfully, I'm just like, well, am I not taking my sin seriously enough if I accept God's grace for me? Right? Paul wrestled with this all the time. It's normal for us to wrestle with this. Paul would say, hey, should I sin more just so I can show people God's abounding grace? No, I'm not going to do that, right? God has forgiven me, says Paul. Paul says, I'm the worst of sinners. And yet God has forgiven me and freed me up with His abounding grace. I'm going to embrace it, but I'm still going to take my sin seriously. But I'm not going to be bound by guilt. I'm going to be freed up, and I'm going to accept the grace that God has given me. And I love how Paul wrestles with this, because we all wrestle with this. But if we have more grace, is sin just not very serious? No, sin is serious, but God's grace is greater than that sin. So we need to embrace that grace, and that's going to do an incredible thing for our lives. Psalm 103 verse 12 says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. That's how far. As far as the east is from the west, that's a long ways, you guys. There's no connection there. When we receive God's grace, He removes our guilt. There's still going to be consequences of sin. Sin is still serious, but we need to embrace it. Imagine, have you ever had parents, have you ever given your child a gift and then they just put it in the closet? Have you ever given your child a gift and they just put it up on the shelf somewhere? Rebecca and I, we've done that so many times. We've given a gift and it just gets abandoned. It just gets forgotten. And then secretly, years later, we take it and we sell it on Facebook Marketplace or just give it away. And they don't even notice. They don't even notice it's gone. It's just infuriating. So imagine, right? God has given us this gift and we're just like, no, thanks. That's what the church at Colossae did. Here's your gift of grace. They're just saying, no, thanks, we like the law instead. We're just going to go back to the law, the way we've always done things. No, thanks, we don't want to use that gift. And that's where Epaphras was pastoring that church. He said, no, you don't understand the core value. At the core of our faith is grace. Well, we were talking about this week in our staff meeting. We're talking about how we embrace grace and how that works in our lives. And Roger was sharing, we were going around the table, and Roger shared something about how he was embracing grace last year. And so I said, Roger, that's a really amazing testimony. Can you share that with the congregation? So Roger's going to share what he shared with our staff team here today about embracing grace.
You mentioned about grace, and I said, he asked, what do we think of when we think of grace? And I said, well, it makes me think of what Cindy said. Last year, my wife passed away in August, and it was all of a sudden very quick illness. She wasn't, this time last year, we're getting ready to go on vacation. It was hot in Bakersfield, right? Hot in Bakersfield. Didn't like that, so we'll go to Avila, right? Avila, 65 degrees. Get over there, she'll feel better. She never got out of bed all week. And so we came back and had a CT scan. They said, you need to rule out cancer. The Lord was gracious to kind of let us step into the cancer thing very gradually. And one doctor said it's cancer, it's spread, and it's advanced. And so then we saw an oncologist the next week, and that was on a Friday, went on hospice on Sunday, and Wednesday was our last day. So it's very fast. But as we talked to her on Saturday, the family was there, my son, my daughter, and granddaughter. We were sitting talking to her, and my daughter was explaining to her mom, it's not operable, things are going to go, this way, and and she said, I'm fine, I'm ready. She was looking forward to being in the arms of Jesus. She was looking forward to that so much, so peaceful about that. And my daughter asked this question. She said, are you afraid? And she said, not a bit. And she wasn't. And that was Saturday. Sunday, their family was there. Went on hospice. Wednesday was her last day, and she died at the 29th of August. So from August 2nd to the 29th. And she was completely at peace about that, which was really wonderful. And over the next few months, I was kind of got over the shock of that. And I was doing well. And people were asking, how are you doing? I say, I'm doing really well. And it was a puzzle to me, because you lose your wife of 51 years. It should be, maybe I should be grieving more. But what happened was, it occurred to me one day, I said, the same grace he gave her to face her death, he's given me to face my life. And so I face life with grace, and I embrace it, and the Lord is sufficient for her and gave her peace, and I think she's, hey, I know where I'm going. I know what's going on. Like the saying goes, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And so she faced death with grace, and I faced life with grace. And so it was really an impact to me. And Chris wanted me to share that today. So.
That is powerful. That is powerful. And you guys, that's what grace is. Grace is giving us that gift to face the tough stuff in life together. Grace is the gift that can help us get through incredible times. I think so often we just take grace for granted, and we don't understand how big it is and how transforming it can be. So if we embrace it more and extend it more to others, that's using that gift to its fullest potential. And let's talk a little bit about extending grace. I believe if you understand it and you embrace it for yourself, you're going to extend it to others. If you're not extending grace, and this is tough, it's tough to extend grace, but I believe if you're not extending grace, then either you don't understand it or you haven't embraced it for yourself. So we want to understand it. God's grace is extravagant. We want to embrace it for our own personal lives. And then the net result should be we extend it to other people. So we're going to read Colossians 3. We're going to jump through the whole thing. We'll reread a little bit and then read right through to verse 17. Again, it says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with. This is an extension. Now, these things that Paul mentions, they're the fruits of grace, or the fruit of the Spirit. Some of them overlap with what Paul would say in Galatians, the church in Galatians. Paul is saying that when you receive grace, there should be a natural outpouring of grace. And it shows up in all kinds of different ways. Ways like compassion, and kindness, and humility, and gentleness, and patience. It says, bear with each other and forgive one another. Forgive one another. If anyone has a grievance against somebody, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And that's quite a lot, right? We're thinking like, how much should I forgive people? As much as God has forgiven me, which is, if we take that step of faith, it's everything. It's everything. And over all these virtues, put love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. I think if we have that love that binds it together, I think we'll be unified. Drama and conflict happens out of a lack of grace from one party or the other or both. When you have drama and conflict, you are lacking grace somewhere. You just have to look, where is the grace not being extended? And you might not have a choice whether someone is not extending grace to you, but you can extend grace outside of yourselves. You're responsible for your grace and extending your grace to people. And if we can do that, we can have unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Since as members of one body, that's the church, we're called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom. I'll stop here. Admonish is a word we don't use very often. In fact, I had to kind of look that up and do a little bit of studying. What does that admonish mean? So admonish means more than just say nice things about people. Admonish has a part of it is you want to give wisdom to people. You want to teach people the truth with love. That's what admonish means. So when you admonish, when you're in your congregation and you see someone's going off track, grace doesn't say like, oh, I have grace for you just to go off a cliff, right? Grace does say, hey, in a loving way, I think you might be going off a cliff. And that's what admonishing is, working and reaching out to someone with wisdom and love. And caringly saying like, hey, I have grace for you, but because I have grace, I want to help guide you back into the truth. Guide you back into what God has for you. And that's what admonish is, and I love that word. It's a great word. Admonish one another, and this is just really cool, with not just wisdom, admonish one another through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. That's so cool. We can admonish and teach wisdom and love through worshiping together. And that's why I love these songs that this worship team picks, because their lyrics have truth and power and God's word in them. And when we sing the truth, we're admonishing one another because we're bringing wisdom into the atmosphere here. So I love that. That's a real unique part of Colossians. It goes on to say, and whatever you do, whether in word or in deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. That's the kind of grace that we are to extend to others. And so on our grace core value, we added on to the end something I always like saying, and it's on different signs here in church. I like to say everybody's welcome at Heritage. Everybody's welcome at Heritage. And what that is that's a sentence extending grace. Now, some people get uncomfortable with that sentence. Like, are you sure, Chris? Everyone is welcome, but what about fill in the blank, right? Are they really welcome at the church? And whatever your fill in the blank is, I believe that you can say everybody is welcome at Heritage, and still you can extend that with grace and still be firm on biblical truth. I really believe you can do that. And what you're doing is if someone comes who doesn't believe the same thing, who's living a different lifestyle, who has a different perspective on things, who's voting for the wrong person, you think, whatever it is, we extend grace and say everybody is welcome. That doesn't mean every idea is valid. That doesn't mean every theological perspective is the truth. And here at Heritage, hey, we stand on some great theology. And you could go look it all up on the website. There's a first part right in the beginning. It says, what we believe. And you could just use that drop-down menu and read everything we believe. And it's a great list of theology. Then if you want to even dive deeper, our confession of faith is at the bottom. You could click on that and go even deeper into everything we believe as leadership in this church. And so we stand on this solid theology that our theology doesn't change. Now, it doesn't get into the minute details about everything, right? It's our core theology, which stands firm. But we can extend grace to people to say, even if you don't believe this stuff, even if you don't believe anything, you're welcome here. We want to extend that grace. We want to welcome you in with open arms. Everybody is welcome at Heritage. And that sometimes is a little bit uncomfortable to say because we like to just stick with people who believe all the same things that we believe and look the same and talk the same and act the same. That's comfortable, and that's human nature. We gravitate towards people who are the same. It gets a little bit uncomfortable to open the doors to people who are different, but that's grace. That's what grace is. It's not grace, but it's just grace. I went to a church once where I was preaching at this church. It was a youth revival. It was in the African-American church in North Carolina. I would do the circuit in the black churches and preach in the churches. And this one church in particular, I walked up to the front door, and on the door was a list. Not of who's all welcome. It was a list of rules and who was all not welcome. And on the list, and they got really specific on there. Like, if you are chewing gum, you better not be coming in here. Right? If your pants are hanging a little down, you better pull those pants up, and they better not be jeans. You know, and the list went on and on and on. I'm just like, I don't know if I passed this list. I'm having to do a check on my clothing, make sure my laces are tied up. I mean, it just was ridiculous. That list said, that was telling people grace but. Grace but. I think Paul needed to write that church a letter in that small town that I was in, because he was saying, no, grace is bigger than that. Right? You need to welcome people in, and you stand on the truth, but welcome people in, have a large view of grace. Guys, the older I get, the larger my view of grace becomes. And I'm never going to get there, because knowing how big God's grace is knowing the mind of God, and it still just blows me away. I can't comprehend it. But God's grace is big. God's got big grace for us. But this extending grace is difficult. It's not easy. Forgiving people, looking past people's differences, that's not easy. That's hard work. I remember, I don't know if I've shared this story before. Forgive me, I don't want to be one of these pastors who reshares the same old stories. But I can't remember if I've shared this one before. But it was a story about when I had a forgiveness issue. I had an issue with someone who I had a really hard time offering forgiveness. And you guys can think to yourselves, you have those people. You have those people in your life, you have a hard time forgiving them. Grace, hey, it's not easy, is it? It's so big and it's so incredible, it certainly is not easy. It costs Jesus his life. That's what it cost him. It's going to cost us something. So think about that person you have a tough time forgiving. For me, it was this guy named Jamie. And again, I was back in the day in Winnipeg, Manitoba, working in the inner city. We had this beautiful ministry center in the heart of that high-crime neighborhood. And we would fill up that place with all kinds of kids from all kinds of different backgrounds. And one thing you always had to keep an eye on, if you came to the ministry center on a bike, you wanted to leave on the same bike. No one should be able to steal your bike. So we had this whole locking mechanism. You could get your locks for free, lock your bike to the bike rack and all that. So this one kid came. He said, Chris, Jamie stole my bike. And I looked over and I saw there's Jamie. There's him riding around with that bike. And Jamie was a 16-year-old gang member. He's a pretty tough kid. And this kid was 12 years old or so, and he was sad. He lost his bike, and there's Jamie just riding in front of our ministry center. And I said, okay, well, that's not allowed, so I'm going to go get your bike back. And so I go down to Jamie, walk down into the street, and he comes heading straight at me. He's going to, run me over. And so I just grab the handlebars, and it's like, Jamie, you know the rules. Like, you come to our ministry with a bike, you leave on the same bike. This is that kid's bike. I'm taking him back. He said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am, Jamie. I'm taking it. So pretty soon, we were in a tug-of-war over this bike in the middle of the street. Right? And we're just like, and he saw I was not going to give up that bike. I was going to give that bike, which is in the north end of Winnipeg. That's ridiculous. You just steal bikes and no one cares. You just steal bikes. But he said, this is ridiculous. This guy's actually going to stand true on that word. So he didn't know what to do. So the next thing I knew, I get a headbutt, right to the lip, forehead right into my bottom lip. And that hurt. I saw stars, but I did not let go of the bike. All right? And pretty soon, I'm bleeding, right? My lip is bleeding, and I was wearing a shirt that my kids gave me for Father's Day, and I'm getting blood on my shirt, sitting here in the middle of the road with this tug-of-war, and suddenly, all of my nonviolent crisis intervention that we had been trained to do, I kind of forgot, and I just took him down. And so I just took him down immediately, and he was on the ground, and the bike was, he had let go of the bike by then, and I was saying, Jamie, I don't even care about the bike anymore now, but you're going to the police. We got the police call, and someone had already called the police. We gave this little signal, call the police and all that. And I'm just like, you're just going to sit here. We're going to wait here until those police come, and then you can explain to them what just happened and why you just headbutted me in the face right now. And so I'm just, okay, this is going to work out, right? Police are coming. I'm mad. Jamie headbutted me. My shirt's got blood on it. And then all of a sudden, this car comes screeching up, and it's all of Jamie's uncles. And they're all gang members, right? And they're not 16. They're 20s, 30-year-old, tough-looking guys. I mean, and I'm just like, okay, Jamie, we'll see you tomorrow. You can go on. I'll catch up with you about that bike incident. I'll catch up with you. And his uncles came, and thankfully I had a very good reputation in that community. And his uncles just swore at him, picked him up, and threw him into the car before the police got there, and off they went. And in the whole situation, someone else stole the bike. The bike was gone. So I go into my ministry center, and I'm just like, I knew instantly. I looked at myself in the mirror, that cut and the blood on my shirt. I just said, I'm going to have a very difficult time forgiving this kid, right? And I said, but I'm going to choose forgiveness. And that lasted for about 30 seconds. And I just like, if I find that Jamie, I'm good. And then, I've got to forgive Jamie. I've got to forgive Jamie. And then that lasted maybe a minute. And then I'm just like, oh, if I could have done, but I had to make that choice over and over and over again. I'm going to forgive that kid if it's the death of me, right? And it was so difficult. But the more I chose to do it, eventually, the feelings weren't there for a long time. But eventually, the feelings caught up to the choice. And the more I would forgive him in my mind, the more I start to feel it in my heart. And I actually found Jamie 3 days later, and I said, Jamie, I just wanted to apologize. The way I took you down was not very professional. And that's what and it's true. I was embarrassed of that. That was poor training. We knew better. We knew how to nonviolently crisis intervene in a situation like that. And I apologized to him for that. And I said, you're still kicked out for 3 weeks, but I apologize for being unprofessional with you, and I hope there's no hard feelings. And we actually made up. Right? There wasn't a single kid that I had ever met in that community that I couldn't break through to, because I would not have been able to do it without grace towards them, because they were tough kids, right? So when we extend grace to others, it's not easy, guys. It's difficult. You guys have been through situations. You might be holding on to a grudge. You might be having a tough time forgiveness for someone who's done something terrible to you. And yet grace is there. The grace has been shown to us. So we're asked by Jesus to follow in his footsteps and extend that grace to others. So as we get ready to pray, I want to ask you 2 questions as we get ready to pray. And I want you really to think about this and maybe take a step forward in this whole grace thing. The question number 1 is, have you forgiven yourself? Have you accepted and embraced the grace that God has for you? Or are you just holding on to guilt? Are you holding on to that low self-esteem that they think if people knew the real me, they wouldn't love the real me? If God knows the real me, and he must be so disappointed. Number 1, I just want you to embrace God's grace for you. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've done, God's grace is big enough to cover it. Because his grace, he gave everything. He gave his life for that forgiveness. But he broke the power of sin and death. He broke the power of that guilt that you're holding on to when he rose from the dead. And guys, that'll free you up. That'll free you up when you realize God actually loves me. I'm actually his chosen child. I'm actually heir to the kingdom when I take that step of faith through Jesus. So think about that. Are you holding on to something? It's the gift has been given, but you're just like, I don't want to accept it because I'm not good enough. I want you just to give that thing, give that guilt, give that over to Jesus today, because his grace is big enough, you guys. His grace is big enough. And number 2, if you're holding on to some kind of unforgiveness, that's a tough one too. Just name it in your head. Just name it. Give it to God. Just say, hey, I'm holding on to unforgiveness against this person over this incident or whatever it is. I'm holding on to unforgiveness, but I'm going to choose to forgive. I'm going to choose grace. And you might not feel it, but you have to make a decision to do it anyway. I'm going to choose grace over this person that I'm holding on to that unforgiveness for. So those 2 things today. And man, if we could just take a little step in any one of those things today, that's a big step in our faith. So as I pray, the worship team is going to come up and our prayer team is going to come up, and then we'll sing one more song. But let's bow our heads, let's close our eyes, and let's go to God this morning.